With the cost of living being at the center of the latest political conversations, we should be asking ourselves, what underpins the so-called affordability crisis? The feeling that everything is becoming increasingly unaffordable is not alien to the vast majority of people around the world. Housing, food, transportation, education, nearly everything that determines the quality of life is drifting further and further from the grasps of the public. This experience has been especially jarring for the citizens of the United States, who, up until recently, were able to reap the benefits of being at the top of the global economic pyramid. As the American dream slips out of reach, disillusionment with the current economic system is ballooning. The current discussion focuses largely on affordability. Incomes have simply not kept pace with rising prices over the decades. Inflation has had several distinct causes, some temporary and some more structural. But beyond the root causes of growing prices lies a far more fundamental problem with the nature of the capitalist economy itself. Like any economic system, capitalism must find a way to split the total net output among participating members of the system. The total net output is the amount of stuff that is made in the economy after subtracting material, machine, and other input costs. In effect, it is the new value added in all production processes. Under capitalism, some portion of that new value ends up being paid out to workers as compensation. The remainder is surplus value that contractually belongs to the owners of the enterprises. To keep our thinking simple here, let's not introduce taxes, transfers, and other destinations of surplus value. In the starkest terms, the class of people that exclusively owns capital also owns the output of the production process. That class pays a portion of that new value out to workers, without whom the creation of new value would be technically impossible. In this simplified model, the economic pie is sliced up into two pieces: wages for workers and surplus value or profits for capitalists. Exactly how the pieces of this pie are sliced up depends on many factors, but it effectively boils down to the balance of power between these two classes. The more workers can exert pressure on employers, the greater the wage they can demand. Sometimes this is made possible without direct organizing on the part of the workers. For instance, if an adverse and unexpected effect leaves companies desperate to fill more jobs, workers find themselves in a position to bargain for better wages. This is what eventually happened in the COVID-19 pandemic. Active organizing is, of course, the other big lever for workers. Countries and eras characterized by strong unionization have historically seen higher and more stable wages. Of course, the reverse is very much true as well. When governments played an active role in dismantling labor organizations, wage stagnation typically followed. This is seen in the famous productivity wage gap graphs. In this version, the decoupling of the red and blue lines shows that labor has become more and more productive, but wages have comparatively stagnated. Notice that the decoupling begins roughly in the 1970s, when neoliberal policies initiated an attack on organized labor. Something important to keep in mind here is that the graph does not suggest that workers before the 1970s were keeping all the value they were creating in the production process. The economic pie was still very much being split between workers and capitalists. The difference is that the relatively strong labor organizing of the post-war period ensured that wages grew at approximately the same rate as labor productivity. In fact, the period between the 40s and the 70s was one of unprecedented success for workers in the capitalist world. Under the specific circumstances of the era, the working class of the capitalist economies was able to secure a greater share of the economic pie than it probably ever had. But because capitalism is made up of two major classes that are fundamentally at odds with each other, the working class victory was short-lived. In the end, the capitalist class, which is more tight-knit and significantly better endowed, pulled the lever back in the other direction. The conflict between these classes might appear to stand still for a number of years, but it is baked into the way the economic system operates. Workers will always have an incentive to demand a greater share of the new value being created, while capitalists, who have exclusive ownership over this value, have every incentive to hold on to as much of the new value as possible. This is why any designs to travel back to the good times are fundamentally delusional. Even if we could perfectly recreate the conditions of the mid-20th century, the conflict between the classes will inevitably resurface. The recent affordability crisis is really nothing more than another name for the class conflict that has always existed under capitalism. What ordinary people are feeling, more than an increase in prices, is a perpetual loss of their slice of the pie. To use Marx's concept, the rate of surplus value has been steadily growing, and workers can sense it. Remember from the last few videos that the rate of surplus value is the ratio of surplus value over variable capital, the latter being expressed in money terms as wages. As a variable, the rate of surplus value is basically a number that tells us how new value is being split between capitalists and workers. The higher it is, the more surplus value the workers produce for every dollar of wages they earn. Looking at the data for the US, we can see that up until the early 80s, the rate of surplus value was hovering around 80%. In other words, in that period, for every dollar a worker earned, they produced an additional 80 cents of surplus value for their employer. The ratio began to change exactly as the country transitioned to the neoliberal era. Today, the rate of surplus value sits around 127%, which means that for every dollar earned in wages, workers produce $1.27 in surplus value. The rate of surplus value, which Marx also called the rate of exploitation, has grown significantly in the last 4 decades. The total value produced in the economy today far outweighs the total value produced in the 1980s, but workers now have claim to a much smaller share of it. What happens to the rate of surplus value when prices grow rapidly? Remember that the denominator, variable capital, is the part of capital that is represented in labor power. Recall also that the value of labor power is equal to the value of the goods needed to sustain and reproduce labor power. When prices for basic consumption goods grow, it takes more money for workers to buy the things they need to live. But if employers don't raise wages, then workers are left buying less of those necessities. In other words, the basket of goods that determines the value of labor power stagnates or even shrinks, even as the overall output of the economy expands. Because they overwhelmingly influence both prices and wages, companies can choose to offset inflationary shocks onto workers in order to protect their profits. This is why we see the uptick in the rate of surplus value during the pandemic crisis, and why companies reported historic profits despite workers feeling the pains of pandemic-induced inflation. The steady climb of the rate of exploitation is a testament to the significant power imbalance between capitalists and workers. Not only has organized labor been systematically dismantled over the years, but capitalists have managed to shift the burden of every major crisis onto working people. The economy has recovered from every crisis, but only in a broad sense. In reality, the situation has only gotten worse for the majority of workers. The latest inflationary episodes, resulting from the pandemic and the ongoing military conflicts around the world, have accelerated the redistribution from workers to capitalists that has been playing out for several decades. The slow burn that was ignorable in the US thanks to cheap consumer goods and debt-financed consumption has transformed into an unavoidable fire fueling discontent and disillusionment. In response, both of the dominant political parties have offered to turn back the clock, hoping to capture the magic of mid-century prosperity. But neither party has any serious interest in promoting the one thing that made it all possible: strong, organized labor. The reality is that even the most successful time travel magic trick will only put off a future crisis. The simple fact is that a system cannot be stable in the long run if one class of people exclusively owns the economic output while the other class produces the output. The interests of these classes are definitionally opposed. One class seeks to maximize compensation for its ownership, while the other class seeks to maximize compensation for its work. The way forward is the popular, democratic control over economic output. This change will not eliminate competing visions for what to do with society's net surplus, but it will dissolve the fundamentally opposed incentives that are baked into the current economic system. No governing political figure or group in the US proposes this solution, let alone platforms the appropriate language to describe the historical moment. And yet, moving towards a socially owned and operated economy is the only permanent fix for the perpetual crisis. This video is brought to you by Means TV, a worker-owned, anti-capitalist streaming service. If you want to help Means TV build a viable haven for leftist media and enjoy its excellent selection of content, we strongly encourage you to sign up for our membership. By clicking the link below and signing up, you would be supporting both Means TV and our channel. The link offers you 20% off of your first month or 20% off of the annual plan. By subscribing, you would be paying into the establishment of an alternative, anti-capitalist media space. You would also be directly supporting our channel. And, of course, you would get access to incredible content. If you're able to spare $7 a month, this is an excellent use of that money.